first manned mission through deep space is about to reach its final destination, Mars. The crew must now prepare for the most dangerous stage of this perilous expedition, landing on the surface of the Red Planet.
Entry, descent, landing is obviously the most complicated because it's the most death-defying portion.
We are go for Mars entry. Stand by. In 3, 2, 1.
Once you start the entry, descent and landing through the atmosphere, there's no turning back.
And when you go and you go all the way to the surface. It's very scary and happened really quick because going from the outer top of the atmosphere of Mars to the surface is only about 6 minutes.
For entry, descent, and landing, we are roughly...
The Americans have dubbed landing on Mars the 6 minutes of terror. 6 long minutes when all the controllers and astronauts can do is wait and pray that everything does what it's supposed to.
Stand by for drone deployment. In 3.
If you're on your way in and you lose your heat shield, you have a problem with your heat shield, that's the end of your mission. It's got to work. It's got to work the first time.
2, 1.
Aeroshell malfunction.
Fire the rockets. Firing rockets. We've lost guidance.
We have one shot to get it right. Their lives are in our hands.
Landing on Mars is a complex 3-stage process. Entry, descent, and landing. Stage 1 starts when the lander enters the Martian atmosphere, 125 kilometers above the surface, and lasts about 2 minutes. The spacecraft is hurtling towards the surface at 16,000 kilometers an hour, 20 times the speed of a jumbo jet. Friction heats the air around the outer skin to 4,000 degrees Celsius. So hot, the lander appears to be cutting through the atmosphere like a blowtorch.
You're basically burning a hole through the sky on Mars, ionizing the atmosphere as you move through it, and punching a hole of burnt ionized gas. And that hot gas is looking constantly for methods of getting into cracks and burning the rest of the spacecraft up.
The only thing that's keeping the crew from being roasted alive is the aeroshell, a protective shield that's covered with a heat-resistant skin.
Columbia, Houston, comm check. Columbia, Houston, UHF, comm check.
The fatal accident of Space Shuttle Columbia in 2003 was a deadly reminder of what can happen if the heat shield fails.
We are only acquiring false locks at this time.
I copy, Fido.
Since that day, engineers around the world have been working on new kinds of armor to protect the crew. Neil Cheatwood is an atmospheric entry systems expert at NASA's Langley Research Center in Virginia.
What I'm standing in front of is the command module of the Apollo 12 flight. This is a capsule with a heat shield on it, because when you come into the Earth's atmosphere at very high speeds, you generate a lot of heat.
This heat shield saved the lives of the Apollo crew re-entering Earth's atmosphere. But the Martian atmosphere poses a much bigger challenge.
It's kind of the worst of both worlds. Mars has not enough atmosphere to land like we land a spaceship from on Earth, but too much atmosphere to land like we do on the moon.
Apollo 11, this is Houston. How do you read?
When we landed on the moon, we had a landing system that was designed to land on a body that has no atmosphere. And so we could come up with a shape that's just totally functional for the landing system. And so if you look at the lunar lander, you can see the legs hanging off of it. You can see fuel tanks and stuff because it didn't have to be aerodynamic.
The lunar module had an outer surface about the thickness of a can of Coca-Cola. Very, very thin. And that's not enough protection. On Mars itself doesn't start at the surface. It goes way up. There's all this atmosphere. It's still only 1% of Earth's. That's enough for it to create a huge amount of heat as the vehicle screeches through this atmosphere.
But this heat shield has a second critical job. While protecting the crew during the firestorm of entry, it will also double as a brake. And that's a big job, because this lander will be a monster compared to anything that's ever landed on Mars before. In 1976, NASA successfully landed 2 unmanned probes on Mars. Each of them weighed 1 ton, the equivalent of a Volkswagen Beetle. A lander carrying humans will weigh up to 60 tons. That's 4 times heavier than what landed on the moon.
And the reason for that is because they have to stay there longer. Once they get to Mars, you're not going to leave in 3 days. You're going to stay there for weeks and weeks and weeks. Plus, you need to bring all the equipment down to help you get back home.
If the heat shield can't slow it down, the 60-ton lander will crash through the atmosphere like a freight train.
If you had a rock and a feather on Earth and you dropped them, the feather would land after the rock. Now on the moon, if you had a rock and a feather and you let go, there's no atmosphere to slow them down, and so they accelerate at the same rate and they fall clunk together. We're doing the same thing at Mars as we'd be doing on Earth in the sense that we want to make our systems more like a feather. Large surface area and a small amount of mass is more like a feather.
To make them more like a feather, the 1-ton probes used an aeroshell, 3.5 meters in diameter. But a 60-ton human lander would need one 26 meters across, large enough to swallow up 5 bungalows. Now imagine the rocket you'd need to get something that big off the ground.
There's a limit to how big we can make these rockets, okay? And in fact, you don't want to make a rocket unnecessarily large in diameter just to accommodate this aeroshell. So what we are developing now is an inflatable aeroshell where you would have a rigid portion like this that's inside the launch shroud, and from it then, after you get out of the launch shroud, you can deploy this inflatable shape.
In Moscow, Valery Fichenko, a thermal protection specialist with Lavochkin Aerospace, is working on the same idea. The Russian heat shield is made of a special mix of organic polymers, similar to the materials used to make Navy Zodiacs, but with one huge difference. To keep the Mars crew alive, this inflatable is designed to withstand temperatures 4 times hotter than molten lava.
Here we use a different substance to cover the material. The substance does not burn away. It evaporates from the surface. While evaporating, it absorbs the heat from the environment and maintains the same temperature.
It's like sweat on human skin, cooling the body as it evaporates. Tests show that this protective layer will only last about 3 minutes. But that's long enough to survive the fiery heat of entry.
The inflatable technology is still in its early stages of development. However, I believe that this is a breakthrough technology, and the future belongs to it.
But not everyone agrees.
There's a surprising amount of resistance to inflatables in the conservative aerospace community because they don't have that much experience with it and they can't point to the designs they've used for the last 30 years. But I was literally walking down the hall at JPL once and you know, talking to some guy, and he said, "Oh, right, like you want to go to Mars in a balloon?" And I said, "Hey, hang on a second. If that balloon is made out of the same stuff that keeps cops alive when they get shot by a high caliber bullet, you know, then yes, I do want to go to Mars in a balloon."
Glenn Brown, president of Vertigo Aerospace, believes his inflatables are tough enough to land on Mars.
The kinds of strength and stiffness that we estimate are necessary for even the 60-ton landers are achievable with this type of structure that we're building today. Its strength is related to pressure when you think of inflatables. And so if you took an air mattress and just kept pumping more air in it, it would swell up and grow until it finally burst. We take the same thing in a way and we wrap fibers around it. So this beam that I'm standing next to here, for instance, is inflated to 60 psi. It's about twice what the tires on your car would be inflated to. Another good thing about this type of structure is that it's very difficult to actually break. A structure like this can be designed, and we in fact do design them, to be able to take an overload, and when that overload is released, to pop back. So you really can't break them in the normal sense.
Strong enough and heat resistant. Thanks to inflatable technology, the crew will be able to survive the first 2 minutes of those 6 minutes of terror. With the aeroshell gone, they are still blazing through the Martian atmosphere 6 times faster than a Formula One race car. They'll need to put the brakes on fast. And now, the biggest threat is one the crew can't see. NASA calls landing on Mars the 6 minutes of terror. So far, the lander has survived the fiery temperatures of entry, but now it's just 4 minutes from impact.
2, 1.
Traveling at over 18,000 kilometers an hour, the crew needs to slow the capsule down in a hurry. But here, the Martian atmosphere, or lack of it, creates a whole new set of problems. With unmanned probes during the descent stage, engineers have traditionally used parachutes to control the speed as the lander approaches the Martian surface.
When you take humans and the food and water and auxiliary equipment to keep a habitable space for humans, when you take that to Mars, the vehicle gets so heavy that we have to make parachutes that are as big as the Rose Bowl Coliseum here in Pasadena. They're absolutely huge in diameter, bigger than anything made by human race ever.
Mars has only 1% of Earth's atmosphere. Even the peak of Mount Everest has 30 times more atmosphere. And that's not all.
The Mars winds are cyclonic at times. They include dust, abrasive dust. They include chemistry we don't fully understand yet.
So an impossibly thin atmosphere plus the risk of winds double the speed of a Category 5 hurricane. Hardly ideal conditions to attempt a landing with a precious human cargo.
We've come in this aeroshell and we've taken out 99% of the kinetic energy. The next 1% of kinetic energy is taken out by, typically, a parachute system. That increases our drag. We open up a parachute, we increase the drag force or the aerodynamic forces that slow us down. The danger typically in those systems is that the parachute won't open correctly, or it will break when it opens. Either of those is certain death.
On Mars, the parachute has to open at speeds over 1,400 kilometers an hour. But some of the same stresses can be replicated at a much slower speed in Earth's denser atmosphere. Even without the Martian hazards, the test results aren't good.
We may choose to try and skirt that problem by giving up the parachute part of descent and going straight to using our rocket engines and our propulsion system.
Leonid Gorshkov at Russia's Energia Space Corporation has already made his decision. Parachutes are just too risky.
Дело в том, что посадка
I fervently believe that the spacecraft should not have to undergo any changes during that critical window. Nothing should be unfurled, inflated, It should land in the same state as it was launched.
Чтобы не менялось в нем, вот как вы сделали на Земле.
With no parachute to slow them down, the Russian crew will have to fire their descent engines much sooner. But that decision comes with a penalty.
Now you're talking about carrying a lot more fuel for the descent engine. Well, if you're carrying a lot more fuel, then you've had to expend a lot more energy on Earth to get that whole thing to Mars. And of course, there's probably less science payload on board the vehicle. Maybe, in fact, all that extra fuel has had to leave 1 or 2 astronauts in Mars orbit.
Russia has good reason to be cautious. 80% of its unmanned missions to Mars have failed.
Mars has been a planet of peril for landing robotic space vehicles. And all of us have experienced failures, from the European colleagues to the Russian colleagues to the Americans.
Back in 1999, NASA lost 2 probes en route to Mars. One was the Polar Lander, the other was the Climate Observer. Due to some very poor mathematics between 2 teams of NASA engineers, they thought the spacecraft was hitting the Mars interface at about 130 kilometers. It actually hit the Mars interface at about 60 kilometers, 70 kilometers, burnt up in the atmosphere and crashed into the planet. So they just didn't know the difference between metric and imperial units of measurement. Not good.
And this time, there will be lives on the line, so mistakes will be fatal.
Those last few minutes, as we come out of hypersonic types of flight into subsonic safe landings, is where there's so many free variables. It's that final slam on the brakes, and now you're safely nestled on this beautiful Mars landscape.
As if things weren't complicated enough, their habitat and supplies will have been sent in advance. So if the lander doesn't hit a precise target, the crew will be stranded.
Unable to pick a landing location due to test.
If you're coming in, you've got to hit that landing ellipse, they call it. And if you've got stuff already on the surface of Mars, you've got to land right by it. If you don't land near that stuff, you're not coming home.
Landing on Mars is a complex, 3-stage process. So far, the astronauts have survived the searing heat of entry and maneuvered the lander through the killer winds during descent. Now they have just 90 seconds to find a safe place to land.
Fire the rockets! Firing rockets!
But where exactly is that? In August 2005, NASA launched the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. Part of its mission is to take high-resolution images of the planet. These photos will help locate landing sites for future Mars missions.
MRO will give us the vision to see Mars for what it will look like for us, to find the safe places, to see the chemistry of the places that we should go visit. We don't want to walk into a toxic waste dump on Mars, but we do want to go to places that are interesting enough for human occupation, human exploration, human learning. So MRO is going to be our new eye in the sky on Mars.
Ruslan Kutsmi is a planetary cartographer who worked with NASA to select landing sites for the Spirit and Opportunity rover missions.
We cannot just land wherever we like. We have to be specific when choosing a landing site for humans. They will be working on the surface for a while, and in the future, the area might be used to build a base.
As well as landing near their supplies, landing in a location where there used to be water is the top priority for a manned mission. If there's any life on Mars, chances are that's where it will be. NASA is now receiving images from the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter showing stronger evidence of recent water flow near Mars' equator. With this new information, they may soon be able to pinpoint the perfect landing spot for humans. So once we know where to go, the next challenge is getting the lander down onto the surface, gently. NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California. Chief Engineer Rob Manning has successfully landed a robotic mission on the Red Planet, not once, but 3 times. For the Spirit and Opportunity rovers, NASA came up with a simple solution borrowed from the family car, the airbag.
You might think the airbag system is very different than the rocket landing, but they're really very, very similar. Now we're thinking about, well, how do you expand these ideas to these large systems?
An airbag would hit the ground at 40 Gs. That's about 20 times what you'd feel on the wildest amusement park ride.
How do we want to land people? We don't want to land them in airbags at 40 Gs. They'll pass out. People pass out at rides at Disney World at 2 Gs.
With airbags not an option, the only choice left is to ease the lander down using rocket propulsion. But where there's rocket fire, there's potential for trouble.
The way we envision landing men on Mars is to use the rocket engines to land us softly on the surface. It's a lot like the Harrier jump jets. They're actually quite tough to land vertically, and it takes pilots a long time to learn how to do that. So you imagine doing that in a gravity field that you would never have been able to practice in. You know, if you damage the vehicle, you're not going to be able to use it to come home. Unlike the Harrier, if you have a rough landing, the mechanics come out, they fix it up, and you're ready to take off later. We don't have that luxury when we go to Mars.
And chances are good that the landing is going to be rough. The Martian terrain is unforgiving, full of craters, rocky mountains, and boulders, reminiscent of the terrain that NASA encountered on the Moon.
Apollo 11, this is Houston. How do you read? 50 down at 2.5. 19 forward. Altitude, velocity, light. 3.5 down. 220 feet. 13 forward.
As we were getting very close to the moon's surface, it became very apparent to the astronauts on board that where the automated landing sequence was taking them was not a safe landing site. It was full of boulders which were potentially bigger than the lunar module itself.
Roger, we're observing the Dimple crater now.
Our autopilot was taking us into a very large crater, about the size of a big football stadium, with steep slopes on the crater covered with very large rocks about the size of automobiles. That was not the kind of place I wanted to try to make the first landing.
Down nicely, 200 feet. 4.5 down. 5.5 down.
Neil Armstrong had no choice but to override the onboard computer and switch to manual control.
Eagle, Houston, you're a go for landing, over.
But of course, he didn't have a very large margin of fuel here. We were getting very close to the surface. The aim of the exercise at this point was to get on the ground.
Forward. Forward. 40 feet down, 2.5. Picking up some dust.
For the next 30 seconds, the mission and the lives of the astronauts hung in the balance.
Contact light. Okay, engine stop. ATA at a descent. We copy you down, Eagle. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot. Magnificent sight out here. Magnificent desolation.
It's an interesting place to be. I recommend it.
God bless you. Good night from Apollo 11.
It was a close call, one that NASA doesn't want to repeat on Mars. So Bob Richards of Optech Industries in Toronto, Canada, is testing a new generation guidance system that will help the Mars lander spot dangerous obstacles within seconds.
One of our problems is there's no GPS on Mars or any other planet. We don't have the information infrastructures on other planets that we have on Earth. So when we get to Mars, we don't have any reference frame. It would be like jumping out of an airplane with a blindfold.
So engineers are counting on something called LiDAR. It's like radar, except instead of using radio waves, it measures distance using beams of light.
The computer screen shows safe landing sites as green, that's very safe territory, and very dangerous areas as red. So to stay away from the red, that's unsafe.
Landing on Mars is like throwing a dart at a moving target. Figuring out where it will hit is what engineers like Canadian Jean de La Fontaine call the uncertainty ellipse.
The uncertainty ellipse is the area where we know we will land within it, but we don't know exactly where within that area. Typically on Mars right now, on current technologies, it's about 500 kilometers by 100 kilometers wide.
That's like landing in an area the size of Costa Rica, but not knowing exactly where.
If we want to land close to another vehicle, then we have to be a bit more precise so that we can correct and get to, let's say, a kilometer, hopefully 100 meters to the target that we want to achieve.
Most space agencies will send the Mars HAB and supplies ahead of the crew. This splits up the weight and gives engineers a chance to rehearse the landing. The problem now is putting the second DART in the same spot.
The second you say that you're going to put stuff on Mars ahead of time, you have no choice but to land near that stuff. If you're 200 miles off course and you have no vehicle with you that can travel 200 miles over the surface of Mars, you're going to die.
James Cameron is part of a team at NASA that's developing a stereo motion camera for the Mars Science Laboratory in 2009. But Cameron is playing with ideas as well as pictures. He's come up with a unique lander that may solve the problem of that troublesome uncertainty ellipse.
It occurred to me, why not land in your rover? It's already a spacecraft, essentially.
So Cameron combined the lander with the rover, giving the crew a way to get to the Mars HAB once they reach the surface. A revolutionary idea that neither the Russians nor NASA had considered.
People like Jim Cameron, who've thought about exotic, hostile environments, bring a new perspective to the idea of sending machines and people to places like Mars.
We've lost guidance!
The astronauts are about to hit the final minute of those 6 minutes of terror. 60 seconds that will change forever the way we see our universe. The first manned mission to Mars is just 60 seconds from landing on the red planet.
There are huge challenges that are in front of you. Will it be a cakewalk? Will it be easy? No, but remember, they're very well trained to survive the adversity that's in front of them.
This is the moment they have trained for. Everything has to work the first time.
LiDAR, unable to find a landing location!
There will be no second chances, no mistakes forgiven.
The astronauts are under no illusion. They're in a risky business. However, let's face it, things can go terribly, terribly wrong. We've seen that in the space business before. We'll probably see it again. Hopefully not on the first trip to Mars.
Backup system! Switching to backup systems! Backup system found a landing spot, Captain! We're good to go! Bring it down! Copy that! Engaging!
Billions of people across the globe will be glued to their TV sets and radios, waiting for news from the crew. Did they survive the 6 minutes of terror? Did they crash and burn?
You know, the signals of what you're doing are being beamed out, and in 11.5 minutes from now, they'll actually get to Earth. So the people on Earth don't even know how well things are going until 11 minutes later. So you're very alone.
Outside the hatch, a very hostile planet awaits. One that humans were not made to live on, and without the right protection, will definitely die on. Mars is more barren than the driest desert on Earth. Its atmosphere is carbon dioxide, poison to human lungs. The daytime temperature at the equator may reach a balmy 20 degrees Celsius, but at night it can plummet to minus 100. Then there's the chill factor. Cyclonic winds whip up huge electrical storms that scour the terrain for months on end.
When we go to Mars, we will have drawn that line, connected those dots, and we will have changed the way people are.
That great experience of discovery, that great realization that we've now added to the human knowledge about the surface of Mars, you know, that's an incredibly powerful moment.
The first time humans set foot on the planet Mars will be monumental. It'll be exciting. It will be the moment in history where humanity has reached out to another planet. And you only get one chance to make that first move. We went to the moon, we've been there, but now we're about to set foot on Mars. That will be very special.
The astronauts won't have much time to savor it. They must get to the habitat that was sent to Mars ahead of the mission. This 40-ton ship will be the crew's home away from home for the next 18 months. With the space of a small 2-bedroom apartment, the crew of 6 will work, eat, and sleep in these cramped quarters. But the crew hasn't come to Mars for the accommodations. They're here to find signs of life. And that means exploring a place that's doing its best to kill them. On top of the poisonous atmosphere and the deadly storms, there's the lethal radiation. During solar storms, the sun can send out waves of it that reach Mars in less than 20 minutes. Radiation so intense, it will punch through a spacesuit or the wall of a hab like bullets going through paper.
It does amazing damage to the top surface layers of your skin. And if you get subjected to it often enough, of course, the penetration to more sensitive organs in your body increases.
The Mars hab will be insulated by radiation-absorbing materials, including a thick polyethylene layer in the walls and tons of water that will have been lugged all the way from Earth. The crew will be safe while they're inside the hab, but exploring and working on Mars will be a journey of deadly extremes. One piece of equipment will make the difference between life and death. Every time the astronauts step out of the Mars hab, they'll be facing death. Only the desperately thin layer of their spacesuits is protecting them from this hostile environment. Nobody has worked on a walking spacesuit since Apollo, but now space engineers are taking up the Mars challenge. Once a year, near Meteor Crater, Arizona, Joe Cosmo, one of NASA's most experienced spacesuit designers, conducts extensive field tests.
Essentially, what we're trying to do is demonstrating the technologies and the systems that are going to be necessary for planetary exploration.
Today, the team will be testing one of the most advanced Mars prototype spacesuits. It's the Mark III, a highly complex machine with 20,000 parts, twice as many as most cars. It costs around $10 million. Think of it as a one-man wearable spaceship propelled by muscle power.
You want to give the crew person that's going to be on that surface the greatest mobility that he has.
The key to the suit's mobility is a series of joints rotating on ball bearings.
So if you're trying to go from one place here to here, and you've got lots of different joints, you've got a side bearing, an upper arm bearing, and a wrist bearing, you don't have to follow one path and remember that path all the time. You can go wherever you decide you want to, from point A to point B.
Geologist Dean Epler has spent more than 100 hours testing the Mark III suit. It's designed to be user-friendly, with an ingenious rear entry system. The backpack opens like a refrigerator door, and the astronaut simply eases himself into a fully assembled suit. The suit must be perfectly sealed and then pressurized, creating a layer of artificial atmosphere around the wearer. The suit also needs a tough skin. In Mars' vacuum-like environment, if a large rip occurs, the air inside could be sucked out so violently, the astronauts' lungs would burst like exploding balloons. At Meteor Crater, the suit pressurization check is complete and Dean can start the trials.
Okay, proceed to test point 1, please.
Roger.
Mobility is excellent, but there's a price. The suit has a weight problem. With all those metallic bearings, it's a hefty 95 kilograms. That's like walking around with a full-grown man on your back. On Mars, thanks to the lower gravity, the suit will feel like it weighs only 35 kilograms. But that's still too much to expect an astronaut to carry around all day.
In the soil. This is probably a good place to do a...
Joe Cosmo and his team will have to cut the suit's weight by half or more, and that's a tall order.
See how far down we can get.
The weight problem is why spacesuit designers at Delaware-based ILC Dover are experimenting with tougher, lighter fibers that can still withstand the extreme conditions on Mars.
The lab that we have here is definitely a torture chamber to find the limits of those materials and spacesuit assemblies. So there is a product called Superfabric. Superfabric utilizes epoxy-based materials that are like little armor plating to allow the material to be locally flexible, but in this case, globally stiff and protective.
Okay, and I have a pretty heavy grit sandpaper in here, so let's just see what happens.
Superfabric is 14 times more cut-resistant than medium-weight leather, making it one of the toughest, flexible materials in the world. Resilient enough for Mars, but design engineer Keith Splund wonders if the thin Superfabric gloves are warm enough.
His fingertips get cold easily.
The lowest temperature ever recorded on Earth is minus 87 degrees Celsius. On Mars, that kind of cold is considered normal. So, just handling a rock or a metal tool could cause severe frostbite. Keith himself will be testing his new design firsthand by grabbing an aluminum bar frozen down to minus 150 degrees Celsius. To pass the test, the new gloves will have to protect Keith's hand from the intense cold for at least 30 seconds.
Yeah, the suit fit is perfect today.
Touching this aluminum bar barehanded would cause as much skin damage as plunging your hand into boiling water.
Temperatures are still in range. Yep. Do you have any discomfort, Keith? Everything feeling okay in your hand? No discomfort right now. All right. Temperatures are looking good. Bar temperature is currently negative 180 degrees Fahrenheit. Are you okay? Feeling good. All your fingertips are looking okay. You have one going a little low, roughly 56 degrees
There you go,
Fahrenheit.
50.
50 degrees. Remove hand.
Okay.
Very good, Keith. Good test.
The test proves that the thin Superfabric gloves are as warm as the old bulkier designs.
How you doing, dude? Feeling pretty cold?
Back at Meteor Crater, the Mark III spacesuit completes another test run.
Thanks, sir. Mobility's excellent. Basically, I can move in the suit like I move in a suit of clothes.
You don't want to go and do exploration and find it doesn't work once you get there. Better here than on Mars.
This suit will have to be perfect because Mars has another nasty surprise in store. Dust cyclones up to 5 times larger than a full-blown tornado on Earth. What are the chances of survival if an astronaut is swallowed up in one of these? On Mars, the most active natural force is the wind. For astronauts, it could also be the most dangerous. On Earth, a dust devil can swell to the size of a skyscraper. On Mars, they can be as wide as a city block, as tall as Mount Everest. But it's not the size that makes them dangerous. It's what you can't see that really does the damage. On a windswept field in Arizona, a team of researchers gets set to go hunting dust devils.
We're trying to get a full picture of what these dust devils are and what they're made out of.
The idea is to study the devils we know to be ready for the big ones on Mars.
The reason what we're doing here is important to the future of manned Mars exploration is, dust and dust devils could be a hazard. It could be highly charged, it could be dangerous to electrical equipment, it could be a death knell for a manned crew, certainly if they're kind of aware of it, that could be a problem.
Stephen Metzger lives to chase dust devils. His ride is part pursuit vehicle, part mobile lab, with 3 complete weather stations.
My Dust Devil chase truck Dasher is all about getting out into a dust devil, because they don't come to us, and from the ground on up, right close to the ground, figure out wind speed and direction, humidity, temperature, pressure.
Another team joins the hunt to study the same dust devil from a different angle. They're using a powerful LiDAR system that fires an astonishing 20 million flashes of laser light per second. It can detect the position and speed of dust devils up to 7 kilometers away. The 2 teams try to zero in on the same dust devil, but nobody knows where the next big one will appear.
Steve, do you see the big red barn to the west?
Well, that definitely classifies as a major dust.
That's the monster I wanted to catch.
Is the laser on?
Get it? Yeah.
Data pours in and the results are startling. Wind speeds inside the dust devil are comparable to a Force 1 hurricane. And the column of dust it's carrying weighs as much as a mid-sized car. That means one of those giant dust devils on Mars could whip up a massive 5 tons of dust as fine as baking powder.
You could have a lot of mechanical wear where the dust gets into gears and the spacesuit breaks down. You're not going to be able to go out and explore, which is the main reason you want to go there in the first place.
But the most disturbing find is the electrical activity. It's 1,000 times greater inside the dust devil than in the surrounding air. Swirling dust particles rub against each other, turning the dust devil into a generator, producing enough static electricity to destroy most integrated circuits 10 times over. So, the much bigger dust devils on Mars could pack a lethal punch, shorting spacesuit electronics. An astronaut might pick up thousands of volts of static energy, waiting to discharge violently at the slightest touch. For a spacesuit life support system, that could be devastating. By detecting the wind patterns that trigger dust devils, the LiDAR technology being tested here could be an early warning system for astronauts.
I believe that the type of instruments we've been testing here are actually going to be on either Mars orbiters or Mars landers so that we can prepare for that eventual first human mission to Mars.
Since their terrifying landing, the crew has had to confront a hostile planet, pushing their life support systems to the limit. Now, they must embark on the ultimate mission, the search for life on Mars.
It's almost unthinkable to imagine anything like life as we now know it to have developed or to exist on Mars.
It will be a difficult and dangerous search, taking astronauts deep under the surface of Mars. The answer to the greatest mystery of all could be within our reach, unless the Red Planet decides otherwise.